Gabbat haddish clarin pop na hochgatan.
They played an enormous concert in Rome to, I think, it's something like 500,000 people.
Ach had with Genesis clues anya savinet ited. Va hachadiat on the skull leomach.
Peter Gabriel was very quiet. Nobody ever imagined he would have a single performing bone in his body.
They had no idea about how to put themselves over.
Programa idan lár
He had this character with what looked like genitals hanging off him.
And I think people screamed and gasped.
Agus dúlain a hit kudaskan cholan.
People thought, well, if Peter leaves, the band is finished.
Phil's solo success definitely did affect the dynamics of the band.
Hadde sin fichet bliana chosiniat clue mis gaskich pop sule hue.
Here's a hit, here's another hit, here's another hit.
Their legacy was just showing what happens when you persevere against all odds.
Bliana 𝑳𝒂𝒏𝒈𝒄, van Galan rock noch Genesis, it hoorst leis a chláracha, the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway.
The band is finally gaining some commercial traction.
They've finally done this huge blockbuster album. People are raving about it.
Be seo an deach go chláracha, van Galan atáiseach go the eerste sa siddevacha seichgin.
This incredible show was developed. It was really pioneering times, especially with Peter and the costumes and the lighting and bringing a lot of theatre to music.
Peter was the band. He was the front man. He was the one who took the lead.
Achas dei bliana te gopit chrúi, van Galan a colin gin gut Amiston me yedig haul, a hannig maach aichar, ba Peter a fakal a hálain.
Suddenly we're told that Peter Gabriel is going to leave the group, and it was mind-boggling really, because he was such a focal point.
Everybody thought, me included at the time, that Peter was completely irreplaceable.
There was a huge amount of doubt about whether the band could survive.
Hug seo bulig an hálan, me gat an eist cogúnig road gus cumalore no Genesis iligal shachad. Acha be seoch te grún an bhachgéine hannig an ráth a chálain, sa déad slí go sedibachud an na súl a hiúr. Bem fewid a band sa bliana 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒊𝒄 ag Scoil Charterhouse an na Surrey. Ban Scoil chánaí dhílann seo a miscin diep a híine agus a beleomiche sa dúich.
Charterhouse is one of England's great schools. It's where you send your little boy if you want him to become a politician or a captain of industry or something, some sort of leader of men.
Haromian is Amazon gach scoiled on the Charterhouse chognach. Ag ús coig blindiag, har an Carrington scoile Tony Banks, Anthony Phillips, Mike Rutherford agus Peter Gabriel, ach son bhí sás an Kilrock.
So there were these boys, and they discovered that they liked music. That was the thing that kind of got them through the difficult regime.
When there was a break time, there was a piano in the common room, and there'd be a mad scramble to get to the piano first.
It was kind of a rebellious thing to do, because obviously at that time the Rolling Stones were always in the news, and so were the Beatles. So I think a school regarded pop music as something, the music of the devil.
Hannig na Carrington cánach gus cálan rock scoile a háiseach.
Anthony Phillips was very much the guiding force behind the band getting together. He was the serious musician who was always behind the scenes saying, I want him, and moving people into place.
Mike Rutherford was the most rebellious. He actually had a moped that he concealed somewhere behind a bush up the road, and he would go off riding.
He was the long-haired wannabe rock and roller with the guitar, which was not Charterhouse material at all. So he was constantly having his guitar confiscated.
Tony Banks was more reserved. He was quieter, classically, trained pianist.
And then Peter, who played piano and drums.
Peter Gabriel was very quiet, very withdrawn. Nobody ever imagined he would have a single performing bone in his body. Yet one day he decided to jump up on a table and sing James Brown songs. And it was like, oh, he can sing really well. oh, he has charisma. And from then on, nobody doubted him.
Rwy'n 𝑳𝒂𝒏𝒈𝒆 gwan gillen 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒈𝒆 cwydymyn, a charon y cwydymyn rhaasio 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂
you know, 2 rows with one behind the other. People looking around trying to see the audience.
They started playing a 12-bar blues, and they played, and at some point they realised that nobody had worked out how to end it. So they just kept on going until a friend jumped up on stage and said, "Stop, just do something else." And they were just about to start one of their own songs when one of the masters jumped up and said, "No, actually, stop." And that was the end of their first concert.
Chapet tosioch rygachus ach fewn, ach ganyan sin, charot dynnygus siswn an rad. Yn jarafli on y sin, hil siawn sgoleth Charterhouse Jonathan King hwn ysgolet gys cwydym horichte a chwmal. Bedia chorym y fasiogan cholan.
Well, Jonathan King had the good fortune to write, compose and record his own #1 hit single, Everyone's Gone to the Moon. Apart from being a pop star himself, he also wanted to set up a record industry, like a one-man record industry. So he was in a position that he could go out and look for new talent.
The band made up a tape of their best songs, and they wanted to hand it to Jonathan, and they were all too scared. So in the end, they got a friend to pass it over. Once Jonathan King had heard the tape, decided he wanted to do something with the band, he said later that Peter's voice just leaped out at him, that the music was okay, the songs were all right, but Peter had a really great voice, and that's what attracted him.
He offered them a recording deal with Decca Records, so eventually they ended up with a 1-year contract.
Hannig tiwndag sonrichte de grach, bacwyd siachat ystioen ysgole idlentyn gocwnant clari, fiws gyda becho isio di daich nocht. Yn esht, ymig at enyam kerst the house on a cholanachge.
Jonathan decided, obviously they needed a name, so he called them Genesis because it was the birth of his career as a record producer.
Sy'n dwloch nuchtieg trifichit sa siach, hai Genesis go Regent Sound Studios an y Lwlyn, so ni hied session clari doialachge.
They had these visions that they were going to be pop stars, and they even went so far as to go out and get special outfits in case Top of the Pops called to have them come play the single on, the big music TV show. Of course, they never got that call. Nothing really happened around the record, but already they were starting to dream in their heads about what that sort of celebrity would be.
Hai hied chlarachge from Genesis to Revelation, a machas na bootjen sa varst nuchtieg trifichit sa lug, a chadw de kusfaltje van football itet.
It kind of fell flat on its face when it was released. An unknown band. I mean, you have to remember that you'd be up against The Who, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. So who are Genesis?
It came upon the world to deaf ears.
The album sold about 600 copies, I think, which wasn't very successful. And I think Decca probably got a bit, had cold feet about it.
Nu de lik Decca siachat de Holland, ba Genesis an de stang, sgynad fiws eith toosiachig. Ach, ban daan gys arachig, nid yr achig at gytau ymolach y mwys sy'n dwi. Am yn lwch diag trifichit sy'n lwch, har y cwstochus rogilyn Genesis ichyd, twa bachgag ilicus tîn an rad cwdiach. Ban y gilyn y tîn gwcrych yn lwnis yn arsgol. Balit fichen tarek si y tînwchge wa holastyn eith feig hasyn. Mar sy'n, ymig at tîn gwcogynig, eith gyda hianig at y hyf y cholau.
The group were planning to go their separate ways. Mike Rutherford was going to go to technical school. Tony Banks was going to study physics. Peter was going to go and study filmmaking. How different would that have been if he'd become a film director?
Hannig balich Genesis go cohúnug dane. Chwdig at dalia de cholastje son bliane. Mar sy'n sy'n lewer, chai atwle gorwch y bon big imolach, swaciol na fdiolach ysgai fat na hwnje wat y sy'n.
My parents had a cottage. It's about 30 miles south of London. Basically, it was going to be empty for the winter, and they lent it to us. So we all moved to the cottage with our ramshackle equipment and set up, and the band started rehearsing and writing.
There were no distractions. They just had to get on with writing the songs and rehearsing. and living hand to mouth. I think they were probably living on baked beans and freezing.
Everybody would kind of drift down and have some breakfast, and by 10 or 11, you know, they were writing and rehearsing.
Am yn bec an fiasan, hiel Genesis le oren agus stuile ŵr, ydda cws na belesichtje agus na pu professiante, na na horen yn loch iddi hiet chlarachge.
What was unusual about Genesis is that they were all writers. People would bring to the party what were generally referred to as bits. And bits were a little chord sequence, a little melody, perhaps a guitar-y thing. The music that emerged was a fusion of all of this. So it was not mainstream pop at all.
They were different and very English in a way, with this sort of mixture of the choral and the classical and the rock music. Now it's called prog rock. Then that was all a new idea, a new concept.
Hadde sydd yn lawer sy'n iawrig sy'n, hwyd na gilyn streit dy chwydymyn, ach charoaniaistioch agus yn beg ach big. Fa grwn an fiasan iddo go siachat yn isht, scharoat y tîn dat na sasge idyn bdiaf amas, sydafachas. Yn o'r sy'n laich y safars dan yn lwch diag trifichet sy'n dich, hachyd gro Genesis y clych sy'n lati cherst.
Somehow, we got a residency upstairs at Ronnie's. Showtime would arrive and there would be nobody there. But the resident house producer of Charisma Records had heard the band and was impressed. And he wanted to get his boss, Tony Stratton-Smith, to come and see the band.
Tony Stratton-Smith was quite a powerful personality. He was one of those people that devoted himself to furthering talent and taking a risk. And he went up to see them performing, with Peter singing away all these bizarre songs, and he was blown away. He loved them. He thought they were terrific.
Having Strat mar y bachgydd, cwnant clarit the Genesis le toeristog lef anachos cwdiach, diech nochtichen sy diachgen. Goheintach va vliel na amasachachge id oprachig nam vader. Ach, at sa vakushen is sheer as na sjeur, hach het roet na gaken jistref. Hip shaw and good suid a vilig.
Well, there's always an occasional crisis in the history of Genesis, and perhaps the first big one was when Anthony Phillips, their lead guitar player, suddenly left the band.
What was happening for Ant is that he was developing basically a kind of terminal case of stage fright. He got more and more nervous on stage. Even though there wasn't anyone in the audience, you know, we were still playing to nobody, but there was something about playing on live on stage that just began increasingly to get to him.
So, yeah, his departure, a lot of bands would probably have folded because although he was the quiet guitarist who hated being on stage, in a way he was the leader of the group.
I remember very well, we were sitting in the back of the van and there was Mike, Peter, Tony and I. And the others were very, very dispirited about Ant leaving and seemed hard to imagine going on without him.
As inish Ant, bachola sydd gro Genesis gysfali cygyddiist, a chwm yn golan ora y ganyan show.
Although it was a bit of a body blow and probably upset everybody at the time, as it turns out with most Genesis changes over the years, it's always for the best.
Mi ydych hawl haid y listeners pdiaf chlychyd y gitar y lianig le fer ciwlog idro Steve Hackett.
Steve Hackett was a great guitarist, and he put an ad in one of the music papers basically saying who he was, what he was looking for, and Genesis responded, and it worked.
Ach be aarchug elis chalan y bydych dochus dogan Genesis.
The band had real problems keeping a drummer. They went through 3 or 4.
An yn nuch diag trifichet sy dich, hoosich Genesis y siŵl drwmed lentinioch le fi cwyd sanis sy feped mleach ciwl Melody Maker. Chwnig Phil Collins yn leach.
So Phil saw the advert and he knew Strat and he knew that Genesis were with Charisma. And so he saw Strat in a bar in Soho one day and he said, what do you think about this Genesis band? And Strat said, they're really good, you should go for it. When he came to us, he'd already done a lifetime of drumming.
From the age of 5, whereas other kids would go off and do normal things, they'd do their homework and then go out and, you know, go scrumping for apples or whatever, or play football in the park. I was upstairs trying to learn to play the drums, you know, which I did all the way through my early years.
He was very much more down-to-earth West London lad and had been through rock bands. He'd done a lot of different things. He'd been a child actor, so he had this kind of inner confidence which the others lacked.
So long as the 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒊𝒄𝒂𝒈𝒆, Uich Genesis Phil Collins geverken het tegen kluche a Benjamele on the Nechtri Kill Pop.
The auditions were held at Peter's parents' farm outside Woking, and Phil, being Phil, inevitably showed up early.
There was a swimming pool, so Phil got into the swimming pool and decided he would listen to every other drummer go through his paces. And then when it was his turn to play, he'd know exactly what the band were looking for. And then when he got up, he just played exactly what they wanted to hear. Very cunning, but it worked.
Hoe het Phil Collins en opid, dat Genesis en echt is sheer aas na baske in de lammes. Zat het boeiluur agus koenant klari een gaan halen. Ach gus liatiger in een goed eestjach agus een lucht lentin, wat een doel een goed kudem in een horst geaatjachen het leek eentjenjach. Am een geet blion de gudit. Van de ballig scholle weet cool Genesis is droghorst dan ulik. Bij het klarach gevaarlijkig, zwaar vergaan het woeilache in de Holland akal. Achron blion de 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒊𝒄𝒂𝒈𝒆, wat is uur het kinjestjach aan Holland. Bertchen, Steve Hackett, agus Phil Collins.
All of a sudden, the ideas that the band had before, they were able to musically give voice to those ideas because the virtuosity of the band was increased when Phil and Steve joined.
Was spionigas uur se Holland agus 𝒂𝒂𝒊𝒄, van goed rock, het hoosje goed die clue agus luchtlentin a hosjengai. Ach, maar wat de kamer zit clue zonrichte te westui soul kill rock, wa onrute jaren, bekan kud shachat.
I mean, the truth is that they didn't want to be performers. They really did see themselves much more as writers. I even remember a discussion about actually performing behind a black curtain. They felt that they kind of got in the way of the music. They had no idea about how to put themselves over as a live band.
When you saw the early Genesis, they'd all be sitting there very quietly, sitting down and playing, you know, like a committee performing.
I think Peter realised way before anybody else that essentially that it fell to him as the singer to kind of develop a stage persona and develop the performance.
Agus shenn derav rut reine. Ik kudem weg aan de 𒂂𝒂𝒕𝒊𝒄𝒂𝒈𝒆, reinig Peter rut sonrichte jenef tron goedemachte.
Peter was on the stage and there was just this throng of people, and suddenly he was just overcome with a desire just to sort of be part of them. And so he jumped feet first into the crowd.
He jumped off the stage, presumably assuming that people would catch him and carry him and, you know, pass him around the crowd.
There was a bit of a masochistic streak about Peter, I think. He wanted to prostrate himself before the fans, and he took it rather too far.
Now, if you're in the crowd and their feet are at that height and they jump at you, inevitably you get out of the way. So the crowd duly parted and Peter hit the floor hard.
I think the audience thought it was all part of the act when he was lying about, screaming and rolling about in agony. But as it turned out, he had actually injured himself.
He sort of finished the set on his knees, and we called an ambulance, and he ended up with his foot in plaster.
As jij lemestjach en jeestjach, hoe me edele glissen in de marst oelar. Aan de 𒂂𝒂𝒕𝒊𝒄, hij Genesis het hoorst zo'n waar foxtrot a hannesach. Agus hoek Peter a goed glissen ka ieder ille in de hoorst show.
Foxtrot had on the cover this figure of a person in a long red dress with a fox's head. We were in Dublin playing in a boxing stadium, and there's an instrumental bit in the middle of the musical box, and so Peter disappeared off stage. I was back at the mixing desk thinking, where's he gone? What appears but this apparition, Peter got a mask maker to make the fox's mask, and he got hold of a long red dress. And he goes up to the microphone and he finished the song, and it just brought the house down. So basically, you know, they went bananas.
I think people screamed and gasped, baffled, especially the drummer as well. I think Phil Collins screamed and gasped as well.
his look started to change dramatically. Peter would find ways of making himself look distinctive, like shaving off his hair or just wearing makeup. Once he had started, the costumes just piled up. They had as many cases of costumes as they did of instruments.
He had one where he dressed up like a dandelion, which I can only imagine from the back of an arena looked like a stalk of broccoli or something like that. And then he would paint his face with sort of silver makeup to look like an old man, and he would sing hunched over. And then, maybe the most notorious one was he had this character called the Slipper Man, which was sort of a grotesque, bulbous creature with what looked like genitals hanging off him.
Genesis were a band that did everything by committee, and you're just like, what the hell is he doing? The fear was that you go out there with a singer who is dressed up as who knows what. That is going to become the focus.
The rest of the guys maybe weren't so keen on Peter Gabriel being the total figurehead in the public's and the press perception.
Gyda heb Cluisan Gabriel scarag 𝒂𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒈𝒆 cha bwrwniar y gola saithig nach rho chwyd drama is 𝑧𝒂𝒏𝒈𝒂𝒈𝒆.
As soon as Peter wore the fox's head on stage, that would have been on the front page of Melody Maker and all the other music papers. And as soon as you're on the front page of the music press, you're on television. So the management and the record company, they can ask for more money.
Like it or not, the rest of the band could see that it worked. And the album started to sell. So he was right. His instinct was right.
As doi clw o chosin son yn gwyd ciwl agos Cluisan Gabriel, sy'n daflion na elensio chai Genesis van yerst gon yerst, so gad ymach clar bio is disc studio iddo ro selling England by the pound.
Each album getting better, with better playing, better production, more interesting songs. It seemed to be progressing at a tremendous pace.
Van Golan chomisniachals gyda chwydad project moro ba am o nwch dieg trifich at y ceir dieg. Clar about da with the heatje van The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway.
The whole 23-song album was performed live, and there were lots of lights, of course, and lasers and smoke and all the things you associate with 70s rock music. The whole thing was designed as a kind of rather like a musical would be today, a stage musical.
The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is generally acknowledged as the Peter Gabriel era of the band's greatest work. It was all the members of the band working sort of at their peak at the same time.
Ach fiws na ranig a cholan in nida show, was strainid cushion. Gabriel a fein up at the hafenga on the natjachan ille.
Peter had been contacted by William Friedkin of The Exorcist to work on a film with him, which would have basically taken him out of the group. His wife had just had a baby who was sick, and he wanted to spend more time there. He was still young. He was early 20s, and suddenly all this real-world responsibility had fallen on him, and he just didn't know how to cope. So, something had to give.
Hannig Peter Cucagúnig a chwyd unig mór I the chor. He gekoerst The Lamb Lies Down 𝒂𝒈𝒈𝒆 an an nuchtiek trifich at 𝒂𝒂𝒈𝒂𝒈𝒂𝒈𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 ga get Genesis as jay och blion na lische chalan.
It was the end of the road for Peter. And he basically just wanted to just to give it all up and go and grow vegetables in the country and be with his wife and family.
The fact that Peter Gabriel left the band immediately after the tour came as shock to people who were paying close attention. The band were definitely primed to make a breakthrough into the mainstream, and their lead singer and sort of main creative force left, which was obviously a devastating blow.
Peter could sense that there was starting to be a bit of a disharmony of some sort within the band, like all the attention was on him.
I think there's a quote from Phil Collins where he says, it gets a little annoying when you realize that your lead singer is trying to sing from underneath a giant rubber mask. It becomes, it was, Peter and the Genesis is. There was a sense that they weren't getting the recognition that maybe they deserved.
Va ballich Genesis tameltjach gro Peter a fakal, van nog glenting sanu doi kudjach. Na de holen in meanjen men a show, hoe staat gro la Genesis shachat.
Well, I think a lot of people thought that Genesis would break up at this point when their lead singer left, but of course the band didn't quite see it that way.
Ach haast van 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 Phil Collins, Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks agus Steve Hackett son a challing. Basen jo noch kumalore.
They had all these great new ideas, and although it shocked everybody else, they saw themselves as continuing with them by finding a new singer.
It was almost like a joke because you could not replace Peter Gabriel. It was impossible.
𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 goráin 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 is an áte Peter Gael hadis in 𝑭𝒂𝒏𝒈𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 As dwy 8 blion na cálag, va Genesis siar as enyamal. Ach, na ys Peter gaif, groi facal, va droch fwy ac sio da na chálain.
Everybody thought, me included at the time, that Peter was completely irreplaceable. He was the one who was standing there at the front with the funny haircut and the fox's head and the weird capes, and, you know, how could they carry on without that sort of personality as a figurehead?
Reunig Genesis cumalore. Chwm ag at sŵlamach son sianyded talentach gan chálan, y fi gerst chotarniach di Peter Gabriel.
They tried about 30 singers, but no one could get near cutting it.
We couldn't find anybody else, so we were literally we were looking for singers while we were writing the music for this record, and we came to the recording of the record and we still didn't have a singer, and we finished all the backing tracks and still didn't have a singer.
Nobody was pulling it off to their satisfaction. I think one day, deep into this process, you know, Phil just got, well, why don't I have a go? You know, we've seen so many bad people, let me sing.
Van dynnu kerst idden bialu fat na húnje.
What no one had reckoned on was how intensely musical and what a good singer Phil is, you know.
So I said, I'll have a go, you know. And one song at a time, we finished them. And then the logical thing is to go on tour. You know, what do you do next? You go on tour to promote the record.
Savars 𝒕𝒕�𝒄𝒈𝒆, hij Phil het bialu eestiach aan Ontario, Canada, maar vrief hunjeted son hier doet.
When people heard that Phil Collins was taking Peter Gabriel's place, I think naturally people were thinking, is this going to work?
I remember going to see the first show without Peter and with Phil, and everybody feeling their hearts were kind of pounding.
Now I could see there was a touch of nervousness. There was definitely a pressure. How do you replace this Peter Gabriel?
It was very hard for me, you know, playing the drums from the age of 5 or 6. You have this security blanket which is around you, and suddenly have that taken away. And to be
up front.
To be out front is like standing there naked in front of all these people, sort of. You know.
Phil Collins, just from looking at him, is an unlikely choice for a frontman. He's short. Even in the 70s, he was already balding. He's not particularly good-looking.
Everybody could see that Phil was nervous, but once he got the applause and once he started to sing and the audience were supportive, then it all the problems floated away and people realised there was life without Peter Gabriel.
Va Genesis yn eisgesial son cilwch yn a harsht unled. Hw gad ymach yn glad trick of the tail as y yeron �𝒕�𝒄𝒈𝒆. Agus ben glad y byhydybach a lefachge gorykysyn. Sed olco adaf y tri sy'n y clar yn ciwl. Ach va awr hien ele yn dŵl tachas sycholan cwydioch. Gag niach clwyche y gitar, Steve Hackett, sgaf Daryl Sturmer aatje sycholan sat eith chwrst. Hwyd at Chester Thompson son y drwmedach gygalos live, leis grotelistynys Phil yn eist ga acal mar prif niach y cholain. Va awr hien ele gystyn yn bar cwydioch, ag diedig na sechgeten va progressive rock gydolomach a fasan. Hai Genesis leis y drw,
You know, they started to see a sort of streamlining of the music where the songs got shorter, the hooks became a lot more obvious, the vocal hooks.
Once he took over as vocalist, he knew that the fans expected a degree of theatricality, but he was not going to dress up. And could you imagine if he had?
A lot of the hardcore fans felt like, oh no, they're selling out, it's getting commercial. I don't think they sold out at all. The style changed, and they were aware of it, and they changed with it.
Hw gad ymach clar a hasbenim fwym sio an yn �𝒕𝒊𝒄𝒈𝒆 van Gietel, and then there were 3.
This was Genesis really becoming a pop band. It's sort of the obvious dividing line between progressive rock Genesis and pop band Genesis.
Agus gasat na commercialte na wat dynja die we doel. Hosjen yn glad sin sydfach ysgaif nach roed diev iddyn as na 10 blion wat cálag.
Well, the album, And Then There Were Three, which was a bit of a lifesaver, really, because it yielded a fantastic hit record, Follow You, Follow Me, which was a top 10 hit. It kind of showed people that despite the departure of Peter Gabriel, they were up for being a commercial, popular success.
So suddenly there's all this media is at the airport. You know, we've actually on a charter plane all of a sudden. That was one big sign of change, you know. They open the doors to the plane, cameras are flashing.
Gyda fad ffata yw, mae yedig hawl fa enyam Genesis id bilen yn dlwy. Sa farst nuchtje kriefich het sa hochtje, ga yn golan timichel y dwyl id hwrstje fad och miasen.
So we said at the beginning of the year, which is 78, we're going to do 3 American tours, play everywhere. We have to tour Europe a couple of times and do Japan as well.
Bes 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒄 commercial te id leva show ach va 𝒂𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒄 id bear version te fill.
My missus said, then my wife, said, well, we won't be together at the end of it. But I said, well, I've got to do it, you know. It's a band, and it's stupid to talk about it, really, because, you know, I should really have said to the band, I can't do this. But you don't, you know, you're part of a group and you sort of all for one and one for all.
When we finished in 78, his marriage was getting really rocky. And, you know, he kind of expressed to the guys that he was thinking of leaving the band because his wife was sort of making some demands and he needed to take care of his family. They all agreed that we'll take the year off, let you get everything sorted out, and then talk about it after that.
As jij tripli on the reunichad pican Portugal, a charoshokus of iko kus fame the fill seven. Te vestui pican viasen vate scaruch. Skus ich heel neintje mich al het kuschen, heel fill gachi, schode intin 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒄 oren.
I remember the real, you know, prolific period seemed to come after that divorce, you know. And suddenly he's alone in his house and there's a piano and it's him and he's got to pour it out somewhere. So that's when he just wrote this incredible string of songs.
Over the period of a year, I did write all these songs that were basically autobiographical. It was like a diary.
In a weird kind of way, because of the pressure he was under, the emotional strain that he was going through, that inspired a lot of the songs and led to people feeling for the artist. Out of this trauma came great music.
Ymysg na horen je skrif Collins van doran eniamal misunderstanding, in dira voran a choshin 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒄 gan dar klarach ge Duke. As jij kiele maar gewoon pop asur, wat groenland boekkiel kluutjach a farpish a lui Genesis on Atkins na klaren. Na misk vat Donna Summers agus na Bee Gees. Ach ik kan gunash de smoe, van Holland ach geheen. Rahosjach na hochgeten, wat Genesis et 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒄 go Holland der Hood. Wat en est et kluwe hoshin ga peen, tron a horen skanyal eg Phil Collins. Svat anchtje agus 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒄 na luch kiul falle kutjach.
In between Genesis projects, Tony Banks recorded a couple of solo albums.
I actually played on Tony Banks' first solo album, which I thought was a great album.
Mike Rutherford started Mike and the Mechanics. Silent Running was a hit for them, and it had to be fulfilling for him to step out with his own project and see that do really well.
Wa Peter Gabriel I de golle huin na euner an een gneamige se hiul. Zwaid kluwe hoshin lish na horen anichte Sledgehammer agus Big Time. Ach bij Phil Collins verre benjamale a hieke gasse gaman. An de nuchtje keetvichit se hun, hoe kville mag a hiet klarekke face value. Klaar of al laan oren bij de skrivig as joi ga heen se ven jalachig. Hoshin na horen face value agus In the Air Tonight, clue is 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒄 it lees na klaren kiul.
In the Air Tonight was a huge single.
You just knew this is a hit song, you know. There was just something about it, that real haunting kind of thing.
And what that song did was it sort of established Phil Collins as somebody who could have a viable solo career. Before that, you know, he was the sort of weird-looking lead singer of a mildly popular band. And then he comes out with this song that's so dramatic, you know, and it showed people that Phil Collins was somebody worth paying attention to. He's being asked to play on albums by Eric Clapton. He's playing on albums by Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin. He starts showing up, you know, he's in Miami Vice.
Anytime you turned around, there was another Phil Collins project. Phil Collins followed Face Value with No Jacket Required, which was his biggest solo project, won a bunch of Grammys. So it made sense that when he was asked to play Live Aid, he was the one person who played both shows, both continents.
It was kind of a stunt, but he played the London concert in the morning, then hopped on a jet to play the Philadelphia concert in the evening.
It's good fun, though. I mean, only a fool such as I would do this.
You know, that sort of made him one of the stars of Live Aid, and that was the thing people were talking about, and that was the thing people wrote about the next day. That was his moment, and he sort of rose to the occasion.
I landed and I rushed onto the stage. I checked the piano, checked the drums, went into Clapton's dressing room, said, "Hi, what are you playing?" Went to the Zeppelin dressing room, said, "Hi, what are you playing?" Went on stage, started playing, you know, really unaware of what had gone on. But I still meet people on the street now that say, "Have you recovered from that?" Which is, so obviously people remembered it, but it was an extraordinary day.
Ra fewn na hochgatan va Phil Collins anichgyd ffigadúil. Sva chwn ar stawn goro agus torstiad falafon cholan Genesis, agus na va asin I the choshin.
Phil's solo success definitely did affect the dynamics of the band. I think in some ways it was felt it was a little bit lopsided, the balance and stuff.
You know, these guys had grown up together, they'd always been a band, they'd always been equals, and all of a sudden there was so much more spotlight on Phil Collins.
I think there was the idea that Genesis had sort of become Phil Collins' side project. That was the thing he did when he wasn't working on his own music.
A charot dat gúil ag Phil bachga go chuide de cholan hain, agus an nuchtie 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒕𝒕𝒊𝒄 va Genesis gus an glare smuach go horstemach, Invisible Touch.
When Genesis came back together for the Invisible Touch album, that was really the thing that finally took them all the way through the roof.
This is a band that had been around for 15, 16 years, and this late into their career, they finally had the #1 selling album in America. And you know, it sort of established that Genesis, in addition to Phil Collins, could be a huge commercial prospect and was wildly popular in its own right. I think that was definitely sort of the band's crowning achievement.
Invisible Touch was like the pièce de résistance for Genesis, because I don't think they probably ever enjoyed quite such a perfect album again.
I remember they would always send me the pre-release. This one in my mind, it's like, I remember distinctly feeling like, wow, here's a hit. Here's another hit, here's another hit.
I think Invisible Touch is sort of the album that we look to as the pinnacle of Genesis' career. They'd long since been a cult band. They'd sort of, gradually been becoming more and more popular. Their singles were getting more and more popular. Their frontman, Phil Collins, was, he's one of the world's biggest pop stars at the moment. And then they came out with this album, Invisible Touch, that sort of, it sort of hit a cultural nerve.
Ba Sean drisú clár 𝒂𝒂𝒈𝒆 va Genesis id mulach na glárin ciúil irín me iedig haul. As a dúting sa bhí an na 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒕𝒕𝒊𝒄 hayat did chuirst. Chluichad céad chudaman an a lang chluiche Wembley strich gur a chuile ticket son na chudaman seo as a bíag 300 míle neach lenting.
When we did Wembley, that was amazing. To me, that was probably one of the real highlights. And that really said it. Okay, now I think was the moment of, yeah, this is it.
Hannig an gálan seo cálag san lárscoil svatanist anichte so rich chlárin id figadúil.
They truly paid dues. They weren't instant stars. They didn't sort of, one day they're kind of, playing in their garage or something, and the next day they got a top 10 single or something, And they paid a lot of dues, went through a lot of heavy stuff.
Van de lia at the show a háisiche as an the Charterhouse is tín chun na híide scorát a nist an an bríomhhace na glárin ciúil, ach bhíh strain súil the ciúil, cús the Phil Collins. An luchtí 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒕𝒕𝒊𝒄 rein Genesis déisial son cuairst at the ile tí Michael a dúil. Van na caritin seo idir bhí cálag fat 50 bliana, sa the tín trohuíochaíon gomatidibh. Ach hast, Bavul ek an da yichet rioslach shora.
Phil's he's a real workaholic, and he'll be the first person to admit that.
I remember other tours, Phil would be quite happy to do 13 shows in a row with no break. But then in later years, he never did like more than 3 or 4 in a row. He would just wear himself out, and you could see his stress level rise during the tour sometimes.
And then eventually Phil said, "Well, I can't do all of this."
As dúir cáras 50 bliana an the Genesis, va Phil Collins I fá skiie.
I remember seeing him playing out in Florida, actually, a gig in Florida. And he was standing on the stage at this huge venue, thousands of people waiting to see the band. And he's standing there, and he turned around to me, and he had a sore throat, he couldn't sing. And he suddenly threw the headset at me and said, go on, you sing. You do it. He said, I can't do it anymore. Then I began to realise that maybe Phil would like to take a break from Genesis, and it was physical exhaustion.
He'd been juggling the solo career and the band successfully for 12 years at that point. But his feeling was that the two were moving in very different directions, and I think he just needed to make a clean break between one and the other.
When Phil left Genesis, once again, rather like when Peter Gabriel left, it was a bit of it could be seen as a death knell. People think, well, how on earth is the band going to survive without, the main man, really?
Ach fa Genesis cyn trachwysyn gyda vrona sio, smosyn, va disha fydd acal son fiach yn y disht.
They'd done it once, so I suppose, why can't we do it again?
So nog fi as Kate fi chyt sa siach diag, hw gad fiach gan gynnydedd Ray Wilson cyn gan Hawan. Hw gesyn sialwg ag ysbionwg ŵrgaif. I think
by that time, Genesis had become so synonymous as the three of them. I just think the fans just probably couldn't cope with it. I mean, it certainly didn't seem like the same Genesis to me.
They tried to tour the States, but the ticket sales just weren't happening. People weren't excited about it, and I think the tour was canceled. That was sort of the last gasp of Genesis.
Get nach de skarren ganan gehofikal an an nuchtje keet fiet sa hochtjek, hai kushen karan savach le Genesis. Har a kustdages roluch glenting gieles a halain gorike daviles a koik. Baun a noorshan a chanig buile halain ek party tje charit gaif an a lunin.
Suddenly the five of us are all there. We're there for the first time since '92, actually. Phil looks around and finally goes, well, we're all here. When's the tour? I think it caught all of us off guard, the depth of the feelings,
For a period, it did look like Genesis were all over, were history, but they weren't. They came back again. Thank God.
So we met in New York in October of '06 very quietly. We, just went into a rehearsal space for 2 weeks. And from the very first day, we just cracked up laughing all day long. And the whole tour was that way.
Ba hullet in jeden doi. Schijn een meeltjen ooglenting kan get, naar ga je dit hoorst woord, ieder turn it on again, is stourig daviele se schach.
When they announced they were touring and the demand for tickets was so high and shows were selling out, it reminded people that people really care about Genesis.
One of the big highlights of their comeback was the fact that they played an enormous concert in Rome to, I think, something like 500,000 people saw them, which for any band, I think that's a tremendous tribute.
To me, it was the most magical tour of all, at this point in history, who knows? If it never happens again, it was fantastic.
Ha je hoorst show hoe dit doi son buile horst kanlag ued ille. Sas joi daichet blionne jen halan, skoik klaar en diek. Ha clue laatjed agus gile bedele ek Genesis on the soul huel.
I think Genesis is going to be remembered for the quality of the music, for one, the longevity for another. There's been integrity all the way.
The legacy of Genesis will be this treasure house of music, all these wonderful albums that they've laboured long and hard over the years.
This is the band that sort of took progressive rock as far as it could go in terms of the complexity of the songs, and the complexity of the music and the stage presentation. They're sort of the ultimate cult band.
They've remained friends throughout. If somebody leaves, they don't become the enemy. They just become a member of the family. Their legacy, I think, was just showing what happens when you persevere against all odds.